Welcome back to the History Hour with Mr. Kent
and Professor White.
We will be continuing our discussion of Mesopotamia. Alright, welcome back to part 2 of episode 3, where we will be continuing our discussion of Babylon and their various neighbors and struggles. The Kassites show up on the scene during the Amorite Babylonian period, but they don't take power until the fall of Hammurabi's dynasty. So who are these Kassite people? The Amorites more or less consider them to be a sort of illiterate hill folk from the fringes of their empire, probably much as the Akkadians and Sumerians had once considered the Amorites to be. Their homeland seems to be located somewhere in the Zagros Mountains, and they seem to have spoken a language isolated, meaning their language can't really be connected to any others by linguistic experts. In reality, that actually seems to be the standard of the people in the Zagros Mountains this time. We've talked about the Elamites and the Gutians before, and it really is kind of incorrect to call the area Persia or call them Persian or Iranian, because they're not. The Persians and the Iranians are actually those later Indo-European groups. Instead, these seems to be a group that speak an entirely different, seemingly unrelated language, even from one another. In fact, the closest connection anyone's found to Kassite dialects is a proposed connection to the Urian Hittite dialects, meaning that they might have been somewhat related to the people of the Mitanni. Like the Mitanni, there is a suggestion that perhaps the Kassites had a sort of Indo-European ruling class, largely meaning likely, if that were true. There's no solid evidence of it, but if it were, that could have likely meant that some sort of conquering, some sort of perhaps descendant of the Kurgan group might have rolled in, perhaps using their superior horse warfare, likely would have taken over, likely would have ruled over them, maybe established a sort of warrior elite who had access to those weapons, those horses, that technology, may have continued to use their own language, but in reality, we don't know, if had that happened, we don't know how much time passed in between that event and their later coming to Mesopotamia, how much interchange might have happened between their culture and the one they took over, the language they originally possessed and the one of the natives, who, that's the thing, even if that's true, what would the distinction be? How different were that ruling elite from the basic Kassite peasant, the basic Kassite tribesman? There's no way to tell because we know so little about the Kassites in reality, but that's some of the possible theories. This would stand in contrast to possibly some theories advanced previously and likely by some fringe elements these days, talking about the inherent superiority of the Indo-European group, or later the Indo-Aryan group. That's entirely not what happened here. If it happened at all, most likely it was the same process that the Amorites used to take over. They, for one reason or another, had the advantage in numbers and the advantage of motivation, perhaps weapons tech, perhaps experience of warfare, that allowed them to take the culture, but then they most likely would very quickly become a part of it, become modified by it. Some of what little we know of the Kassites does come from the language. We don't have a very solid understanding of the Kassite language, but there's a handful of Kassite dictionaries that survive in fragmentary form. Usually that's translations for personal names and for gods and a few other important things like that. Seemingly there are also loanwords to Akkadian from Kassite. It seems as though the Kassites basically gave the Akkadians a number of words to expand on colors, usually related to the colors of animal breeds, as well as various horses and horse breeds and donkeys, as well as chariots and parts of chariots and many things related to animal husbandry. If nothing else, it seems as though that was a dominant part of Kassite culture. If you've ever heard the thing about Eskimos having 20 words for snow, it's because in Eskimo culture, where snow is used to build the house, it's something that could kill you very easily, it's part of your everyday life, they need to have several words to distinguish it. In Kassite culture, a very important part of it was the horse, the animal. Most likely this was a tribal, semi-nomadic people. Even if they were from the mountain region, they most likely would have moved from grazing region to grazing region as seasonal changes would occur, much as modern day pastoral nomads, the ones of this era. There's also some indication that the horse was spiritually significant. I've seen some claims that they directly worship the horse, and I'm not entirely sure whether that's true, but it certainly seems though it was important to them. And most likely it was a cultural thing, even if it wasn't a direct form of worship. Even though there was no sacredness to it, I imagine there was a lot of pride and a lot of prestige tied to the breed of your horses, the amount of your horses, how good you were at horseback riding. most likely, if the culture was really developed around that, the kings and the nobles most likely would have been the ones with largest herds, who could have equipped the most soldiers. They would have experienced that, and that's how they would have went to war. And by going to war, they would have increased their own standing. They would have won territory. They would have further been able to elevate their own power. The connection also with horses indicates there may be some connection to some of these early Kurgan, early Eurasian steppe, Ukrainian, whatever area cultures, because they also had a certain connection to this. And you do see the connection of horseback riding, the Mitanni culture, and the Hyksos are famed for it. So it could have been that all these groups were semi-related in some way, or at the very least it had some amount of cultural contact. Even if the Hyksos and the Kassites didn't speak the same language or didn't have the same ethnicity, if they'd had contact in the past, one may very well have taught the other one about horses. They may have traded, they may have learned things from one another. The reason why we know so little about Kassite language and Kassite culture is that this era is often described as somewhat of a dark age. It was framed as a decline in the class I took many years ago in college, and I've seen it talked about in other places in the same way, and I've seen other people make the same sort of general rejection of, it wasn't a decline because we continue to see the same patterns, because they lasted longer, and in many periods they were more stable than Hammurabi, more stable than the Akkadian Empire. And all that's true, but to some extent it does seem as though there was some deal less literacy, some deal less writing taking place, less history and record keeping. But I imagine that has to do with sort of perspective, like what does a culture find important? In this dark age, it doesn't really seem as though old Mesopotamian culture declined. Kassite gods are introduced, and some Kassite gods are linked to Mesopotamian gods, but the same thing had happened with Babylonian gods who had come from the Canaanite region. The same thing had happened with the Akkadian gods. Their languages and cultures had left a mark on Mesopotamians, but the Mesopotamian culture seemed to be the one that remained dominant. And so too in this era, the same thing happened with the Kassite culture. And in fact, the Kassites either worship or at least acknowledge and perform the rituals of the gods of their people. They maintain the old places. They maintain the empire. They seem to take prestige and base their own legend and their own fame around being the kings of these regions and administering these regions. It's not like the Kassites set about conquering Babylon, Mesopotamia, and tried to replace it with their own. It's not like they tore down all the temples and replaced them with graves. Now, these were people who integrated, but were in themselves different. Seemingly, while Hammurabi and the Ur dynasty may have spent a lot of time codifying laws, working toward spreading literacy and education, it's possible the Kassites just did not consider that as important. They are a people who come out of the mountains. They are a people who fought in this war, and they took Babylon. It's very likely that being a warrior culture, they as a society viewed literacy and religion as important, but not necessarily as prominent in this society. And it's possible that the vast majority of people were perfectly okay with it. Do these people, these ancient people who have seen the famines, the droughts, heard talked about by their ancestors, who disestablished the old empires, who have seen the Hittites sack Babylon, who have seen the wars with the Assyrians and the Elamite and the Gutian invasions, aren't they as concerned that perhaps their society stays as literate? Or would they be more than happy that these Kassite people who perhaps did not value writing as much were perfectly capable of fighting them off? That these horse-riding nomads who still honored their gods, who lived in their cities like they did, who used Akkadian in the writing of bureaucratic documents and used Sumerian in the writing on religious documents, that as far as they're concerned, they were just like the old kings, but perhaps a little bit better at protecting them, a little bit better at actually keeping the border stable. Which, even if this is true, it's not to say that every individual in that society would have thought the same thing. One could easily imagine that if the scenario I've lined out is what happened, if these Kassite rulers arrived and they simply abided by a new set of priorities, while the common man in the street might have considered that to be perfectly acceptable, it's entirely possible that the old scribes or perhaps the merchant guilds who did require a large deal of literacy might have found this to be not the best arrangement. They might have longed for the old period, but they weren't the ones in power. This is a period we've talked about before where class consciousness exists, but the idea of class mobility is not as strong. It certainly happened for some, but for the average farmer in Mesopotamia, I imagine for them the idea of the king of Babylon restoring the Enlil temple and keeping Assyrian Elam at bay probably much a higher of a priority than the scribal school staying in effect and the exact recording of all documents. But for guilds, that might have been flipped. But seemingly in this period, they're not the ones calling the shots. In this period, it becomes the Kassites, who are a seemingly tribal, clan-based people. The focus seems to be the kingship and the establishment and maintaining of a unified, or at least semi-unified, Babylonian empire. Some of the references we actually have of Kassites in the record comes from Herodotus. Herodotus describes them as coming from Ethiopia. Unfortunately, Herodotus was often wrong. He seemed to get confused because Cush and Cushite were used to describe Nubia and Nubians. So his assumption was, both the words sound similar, the Kassites must have come from Nubia. There are earlier references than Herodotus, and in fact, they are referred to a number of times in Mesopotamian records before their ascension. They seem to have come to the cities of Mesopotamia and worked there, both as farmhands and as mercenaries, and it seemed as though some military commanders were like the Kassites. It's possible either they were hired because they were considered to be competent warriors, or maybe they brought an entire war band and fought as a mercenary force. Perhaps they were the mounted forces to some king's ground army. And also, it seems likely that when the Hittites arrived, that the Kassites did in fact assist them. Whether or not they were in a direct alliance, whether the Hittites had hired them as a mercenary force to join them, or if the Kassites had just joined them along the last leg of the journey, because they were heading to Babylon and the Kassites knew that could be some sweet spoils, we're not entirely sure, but it seems likely they were involved in some fashion in the fall of the city. When the city fell, there seemed to be a fairly significant period of time where it remained in disarray, and there was likely that Babylon, as well as the entire region, was probably being contested over by a number of factors. Probably the various old kings and cities, likely these Kassites, which could very well have included multiple clan leaders rather than just one unified, perhaps other raider groups. And out of this emerged a number of powers, the most prominent of which being the new Kassite dynasty of Babylon. The Kassite dynasty would have held North Mesopotamia, while the south would have still been controlled by more or less a new revitalization of the old school Sumerian states, an area called the Dynasty of Sealand, which was more or less basing itself around the old Ur legacy. But the first Kassite king who we have attested in the record in this period is Agum II. And the reason why the first king is the second is because there are a number of early Kassite kings who either were possibly in this interim period of maybe about 30 years or so when we're not sure who really controlled Babylon, the region. It was most likely a contested time. And before that, the ones who seemingly ruled Kassite society prior to their establishment over the whole of Babylon. But Agum II took power. The only major thing he's noted for is he is the one who did recover the statue of Marduk from the Mitanni. The first king, however, we can confirm for sure that was actually in control, was not a totally mythical figure, was Burnaburiash I. He was the Kassite king of Babylon, and he certainly reigned in the city of Babylon, whereas we're not entirely sure if Agum II had actually full control of the city. Once again, because of the chaotic time, the lack of Kassite written sources, and the fact that currently we just don't have every historical source, whether because we haven't found them or because they've been entirely lost, not much else is known about Burnaburiash I, though he did have two sons who both reigned as king after him. Kashtiliash III, once again named after some of the old kings on the list, and Ulamburiash. It was either Ulamburiash or Agum III, who would have been Umguliash's nephew, who reunified the entire river valley. One of these kings essentially subdued the dynasty of Sealand, which is a sort of Neo-Sumerian empire. They were styling themselves as successors to the Ur III dynasty, and they had actually set up power prior to the end of Hammurabi. And often you see in historical dating now, the Hammurabi dynasty is considered the first dynasty of Babylon, and Sealand, despite actually being in power at the same line as Hammurabi, was considered the second dynasty. And they actually were not overthrown until the Kassites were considered the third. So there is some weird overlapping here.
The dynasty of the Sealand, this Neo-Sumerian empire, they call it, kingdom rather, can date back again to the earliest days of Hammurabi's successors. A lot of its success was laid at the feet of a figure, the king of Sumer as he called himself, Illuma Ilu. was basically able to revolt against the power of Babylon back before the end of that period, and was able to legitimize himself as a proper Sumerian or Akkadian king. Which, again, at this point, the idea that he's somehow a more legitimate successor to that throne than Hammurabi's successor is kind of ludicrous, but he made it stick. And he carved out what might be called the Kingdom of Sumer as a result of this. And the fascinating thing about this, though, is that this revolt is very successful. Despite the fact that on the surface it shouldn't succeed, he is actually able to defeat the forces of Babylon and establish the independence and survival of this new state. And in fact, it will last until the year 1460 BCE, which, for those of you paying attention, is exactly 135 years after the fall of Babylon.
With Sealand subdued and the entirety of old Mesopotamia, Babylonia reunified, you have one of the most notable kings of the Kassites. Agum III's successor, Karandash, was called Mighty King, King of Babylonia, King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the Kassites, King of Kardunias. The first time, the Kassites seem to use their distinct name for these territories, which the Assyrians also referenced later. Kardunias seems to be their new name for Babylonia. He also seemingly renamed the city of Babylon to Karanduniash. In a real way, given how this individual renamed the whole of Babylonia and then Babylon, more or less after himself, he would appear to be sort of the spiritual heart of the dynasty. Despite not being the first, and maybe even not the most successful, he is sort of the Sargon, or the Hammurabi of the Kassites. The territories they reign over, and the spiritual heart of their empire are now named after him. Much later, when Elamite would actually sack Babylon, he would say he destroyed Karandash. Not the city, not the country, but the king, more or less equating this individual with the city and the empire itself. This guy is the empire. All Kassite kings more or less kind of look to him as the one to set the mold, it seemed. Later kings would also note that Karandash was the first of their kings to begin sending friendly emissaries to Egypt, and this might very well represent the first sort of normalization of greater Middle Eastern diplomacy, the beginning of sending letters to the neighboring regions and rulers, whatnot. Instead of fighting them and conducting raids, there was actually the ability to treat with them as equals. This is the first time we see evidence in the historical record, given what we found, of the connection between the Kassites and the local religion. Karandash commissioned a major temple of Inanna in the city of Uruk. It demonstrates that either they had adopted the religion themselves, or they were at least putting in the time and the effort and the money to support the locals and their customs. This represents the minimum, if not before, when Kassite is certainly beginning to merge with Sumerian and Babylonian culture. It seems like at this point the Kassites don't view themselves probably like the Gudians and the Elamites, and the people of Mesopotamia likely did not entirely view them as this either. They had started to become them. It was their country, and they were now claiming these people and these gods of their own and spending time to patronize them. After Karandash, Kadashman Harbe I, possibly his son, fought wars with other nomadic groups, somewhat like them, but not ultimately successful, the Sutians, similarly another Semitic-speaking group out of the Canaan region. Kassite literature does actually describe them conducting large-scale raid on Uruk. Later kings claim that Kadashman Harbe I destroyed a sort of massive army of the Sutians and established border forts all along the Syrian region, more or less indicating that perhaps this was also the period in which the Kassites really put the time into making sure the borders were secure, and that what they had done was not going to be repeated by a different one. At this time, that the Kassites would actually make a secure and stable border, more or less controlled by a number of actively staffed forts. Then we come to his son, Kurigalzu, who, if Karandash is the most notable of the Kassite kings, Kurigalzu is at least the second. His name meant shepherd of the Kassites, which, another reference to animal husbandry and the importance of that. But also, interestingly, it's not the Kuri, which means Kassite, it's the Galzu part. Galzu was actually the Kassite word for Kassite. He was noble in that his kingdom actually suffered raids and the direct taunts by an aggressive Elamite king called Her-Belit. He then met Her-Belit on the field in which he was challenged to fight him, defeated him soundly at the battle at Dersogi, and then he marched on the Elamite capital Susa and sacked it. He then possibly installed his own vassal king in the place of that one. Kurigalzu also continued diplomacy with the Egyptians and married his daughter to Amenhotep III, who also married to Mitanni and one Arzawa princess, and would later also marry Kurigalzu's granddaughter. Kurigalzu also married his sister to the Elamite king, Para-Ishan. He was the son of the vassal king who Kurigalzu had installed, thus establishing a very familiar sort of dynastic, feudal marriage alliance situation. Essentially, he hoped that if his sister and daughter and whatnot were married to these various kings, they were his brother-in-law, son-in-law, etc., that they would be more favorable for trade relations, more favorable for alliances, and less likely to attack and antagonize him. And, in the case of the vassal king, likely to ensure his loyalty. However, of all the things Kurigalzu did, none of those was his most notable. None of those was what he is known for. What he's known for is actually his construction projects. These projects were attested across 11 different Babylonian cities, and he then built a new capital called Dur-Kurigalzu, or the Fortress of Kurigalzu. It was essentially built in the northern ports of Mesopotamia to protect vital trade routes from Afghanistan, this time actually more focused on lapis lazuli than on tin. The Fortress of Dur-Kurigalzu also included a number of Sumerian temples, as well as a large ziggurat dedicated to Enlil rather than Marduk, and apparently has confused Westerners for centuries who, for many, many years, would encounter it and believe it to be the remnants of the Tower of Babel. The site of Dur-Kurigalzu also included the Palace of the Whole World, a vast, elaborate seat of power where they would most likely administer the various bureaucratic and military matters of the empire. Since despite being the capital of the empire, Dur-Kurigalzu is not frequently mentioned from this point out, I will give us a quick rundown of the fate of that city. Dur-Kurigalzu remained a religious site of importance to at least the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the temples there were worshipped and knowable. That is at least 500 years later. In the medieval period, there were actually Arabs who did live and use the area for burials. The location was excavated in the 40s, and Saddam's government did not do the worst job of actually maintaining and restoring the site. And they actually include notable areas where researchers uncovered some of the bulk of Kassite art, as well as much of what they know of it in Kassite language. Unfortunately, ever since the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the area has, like many of the others, been subject to looting and actual damage to the ziggurat and other areas. In addition to that, Dur-Kurigalzu is actually fairly close to the city of Baghdad, and the urban sprawl of the city is actually encroaching upon it. Unfortunately, if nothing's done soon, the damage that could be done from lack of maintenance alone could be pretty catastrophic, and the site is essentially still unprotected and unpreserved till today. The next leader after Kurigalzu is Kadashman-Enlil I. He's known for his various correspondences with the Pharaoh of Egypt, at this time would have been Amenhotep III, the same one who Kurigalzu would have negotiated marriage alliances with. He essentially wanted to marry an Egyptian princess. He often referred to Amenhotep as brother. In these Middle Eastern exchange of letters between the Hittites and Kassites and the Egyptians, there was a lot of use of titles like brother and son and father. Notable in some of these is the fact that often a successor would be referred to as the son, or he would refer to his previous king's father. Even if they weren't directly that, it could have been a grandson, could have been a brother. But that's often notable, and often these times these kings were referred to as one another's brother. You see that between Hittite and Kassite kings often. However, the Pharaoh of Egypt, seemingly because of his very long and prestigious and centralized reign, often tried to maintain an era of being a superior, being the first among equals, these kings, and it's notable that very infrequently would there ever be marriage alliances with any Egyptians leaving Egypt. Pharaoh liked to take foreign princesses and fill his harem, but the daughters of Egypt, as they called them, were not often sent to foreign rulers. During these negotiations, Kadashman-Enlil did not end up getting an Egyptian bride, but because he wanted to fund numerous construction projects, he did end up marrying his daughter, Kurigalzu's granddaughter, to Amenhotep III, in exchange for a big long laundry list of gifts. Amusingly, Kadashman-Enlil was also upset that Pharaoh did not invite him to a festival, but he did extend an invitation to come visit the new inaugural opening of his own palace. It is also during Kadashman-Enlil that we have the first remaining example of a Kaduru. Kaduru, which comes from the Achaean word for frontier or boundary, is essentially a large rock land grant. It would have been a piece of stone where they would have carved the images of the gods and sometimes the king at the top, and these were supposed to represent the mythical individuals who watched over the contract. And then would have been subscribed to the cuneiform contract about the details of the land, where the land was, who it was to, why it was, etc., etc. And then it would describe that if such a contract was broken, then the curses of the gods would fall upon those who broke it. Essentially, this indicates that the Kassites were handing out large portions of land, likely as some sort of small-scale feudalism. More or less, they would have sold their loyal followers around the cities, used them to develop them, and these structures would have been a piece of legal monument to commemorate that. The son of Kassite I, Burnaburiash II, then ascends the throne of Babylon. He continues correspondence with Egypt. Seemingly, the main aim of these was to be acknowledged as an equal through marriage with the pharaoh. The aim of this was to gather alliances as well as to basically engage in large-scale trade. The Mesopotamians had access to horses at this point, as well as the lapis lazuli and other gems from their trade routes to Afghanistan. And what they wanted from the Egyptians was ivory, ebony, and gold. At this point, the correspondents are no longer with Amenhotep III, instead with Amenhotep IV, aka Akhenaten, the individual who tried to introduce that pseudo-monotheism to Egypt. Burnaburiash and Egypt's relationship becomes fairly strained at this point because Burnaburiash essentially believes he's being shortchanged by this relationship. He believes that he's not getting as much out of the trade as Egypt's gained, and he also accuses the Egypt of essentially using Canaanite vassals to murder and rob Kassite caravans. In fact, in his letters, he claims Kurigalzu, who once again was supposed to be the guy who began all these friendly relationships, in fact was asked by the Canaanites to join them in rebelling against Egypt, and he refused to do so out of love and loyalty and whatnot to Egypt. And so he's essentially calling upon, in our grandfather's time, we didn't do this to you, why are you doing this to us? And so possibly as a result of this semi-hostility, definitely unpleasant words being exchanged via diplomats, Burnaburiash in fact does not marry his people to the line of the Egyptians. Instead, he marries his daughter to the king of the Elamites and to the Hittites. He and his successors also continue the tradition of constructing a number of restoration projects of old sites, essentially throughout Mesopotamia, areas including Larsa, Ur, and Nippur, which at this time Nippur almost served as a sort of second capital, and supposedly Nippur regained a significant amount of power and became quite large again. They compared to the size of the Ur III dynasty. Those areas more or less see renovation. The Kassites actually go about restoring old monuments, rebuilding portions, etc., etc. They take the ancient sites that have been in Mesopotamia from far before them, and they try to rebuild them to legitimize themselves to say, look at us, we even know your history, we acknowledge it, we want to be the heirs to it. However, during the reign of Burnaburiash II, we have a new contender rising the scene. The Assyrians are once again becoming a major power. Ashur-uballit I defeated the Mitanni king of Shutarna I, which up until this point Mitanni had more or less treated Assyria as a vassal kingdom, and established a new independent Assyrian kingdom. Then Ashur-uballit I visited Egypt. Burnaburiash became upset, sent correspondence to Egypt claiming, he's my vassal. How dare you acknowledge him as a vassal? You should have talked to me, and you and I should make agreements for him. And overall, Burnaburiash viewed this as a sort of rise of Assyrian power. And while the Assyrians have formerly been a Mitanni vassal, they seem to believe that as the kings of Sumer and Akkad, the kings of the Kassites of Babylonia, that they naturally would be the more powerful, the more senior of the two states, and that Assyria should more or less bend to their will. Well, Ashur-uballit was not having any of that, and so instead of simply subduing them as vassals, they once again had to engage in a series of marriage alliances. Burnaburiash married his daughter to Ashur-uballit I, and then Ashur-uballit married his daughter, an Assyrian princess, either to Burnaburiash or his son, or possibly two princesses to both of them. It's not entirely clear. The records seem to contradict, but the important fact is one of the Assyrian princesses was either married to the king or his heir, and seemingly from that marriage came a new heir to the throne, half Kassite and half Assyrian. In doing so, they were able to prevent a conflict between the two nations. Assyria and the Kassites would not go to war, because instead they married their houses and they would be allies. However, this peace, while it lasted between two nations, ultimately destabilized the Kassite dynasty. On the death of Burnaburiash, his son Kara-Hardas succeeded him to the throne, and shortly thereafter, in 1333 BCE, he was murdered during a Kassite army rebellion. Most likely this would have been the Kassite warrior nobility either offended at the idea of the Assyrian queen or the Assyrian heir. It's possible that they would have viewed this as either an Assyrian attempt to subvert the ruling class or them bending to the Assyrians. It is entirely possible that some of these prominent warrior clans might have thought, well, why didn't they marry one of my daughters? And they would have thought, this is a foreign power being able to dictate more power to the king than we are. Or it could have simply been that they thought, this is an adequate time and an adequate excuse for us to make our move and put one of our own to the throne. One way or another, the army revolted, most likely at the whims of the various tribal leaders, the general, the high lord of the Kassites. And they murdered Kara-Hardas, and they put one of their own on the throne. Two different names are ascribed to the individual that the Kassites ended up putting on the throne in the place of Kara-Hardas. Either Nazi-Bugas or Suzigas. Whichever the case, though, this king did not reign long. In fact, the Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit I, saw his son or son-in-law or whatever it was be killed, and the nobles revolt against it. And as he saw rightful heir to the throne, his own grandson should sit there. And so he mustered his armies and he marched south in support, and he fought the Kassite lords of Babylon. After deposing the usurper king, he installed his grandson, Kurigalzu II, on the throne, who have either been the son of Kara-Hardas or the son of his father, Burnaburiash II. Kurigalzu remained on the throne for 25 years, and despite the fact the Assyrians had brought him to power and who had defeated the coalition that removed his father and grandfather from power, it didn't take long for the Kassites in Syria to once again begin fighting. Kurigalzu II may have begun to skirmish with the Assyrians as early as the reign of his own grandfather, the one who had put him on the throne, but certainly after the death of Ashur-uballit, when Enlil-ninari came to the throne of Assyria, the two escalated considerably. They fought one or maybe more major battles. Both sides claimed to have won it. They both claimed to have gained territory. It seems likely the Assyrians may have come out ahead on this, but wherever the case, it was indecisive. This did not settle the dispute between the Assyrians and the Kassites. Notable in this time, however, there is a Hurrian refugee who actually received a kuduru, one of those land grants. The Hurrian was actually a leather worker named Akaptaha. He essentially lived in the newly vassalized Mitanni kingdom of Hanagalbat, vassalized by the Assyrians, who would provide bridles for the Kassites during the wars. Likely this was a semi-rebellious area. The Kassites had rolled in, and this individual assisted them in provisioning their army. And he could have easily been one of a number of individuals who most likely wanted to throw off Assyrian rule, maybe had ties to the Mesopotamians, maybe just hated the Assyrians. And after the battle had occurred and the Kassites had not definitively defeated them, they wanted out so the Assyrians couldn't come down and burn down their house and kill them. So, it seems like in this time the Kassite Babylonians were actively encouraging the former subjects of Assyria to rise up against them and render aid to their enemies. After the reign of Kurigalzu, Nazi-Marhutash succeeded him to the throne. And during this period, there was continued conflict with the Assyrians. This time, they actually evaded outright warfare, and instead, the Kassites appear to be in some sort of alliance, or maybe even using them as mercenaries, but they seem to be in cooperation with the Gutians, one of the other old enemies from Mesopotamian history. And using the Gutians, they seem to have conducted more or less a guerrilla campaign, raiding the cities and the trade routes of the Assyrians, while not outright commanding their armies. And this they seemed relatively successful. However, when facing direct conflict with Assyria, Adad-nirari I defeated the Kassites and their camps were plundered, once again contributing to the kind of continued decline of the Kassites in the face of this new northern rival. However, in addition to war, Nazi-Marhutash continued the usual other Kassite projects. He did the building projects. There were some cities at this point that appeared to have been more or less abandoned, or at least had some degree of abandonment, probably a much larger population previously. Larsa, Ur, Abad, and Isner are all noted to have actually been semi-reconstructed and repopulated this area. With this sort of period of rebuilding and construction in the face of defeats at the hand of the Assyrians, the son of this king, Kadashman Tuguru, established a peace with Assyria. They delineated the line, they called for peace in their time, and they set aside the conflict. This allowed the Kassites to basically have a period of rebuilding, and they cultivated friendly diplomatic relationships. This period of diplomacy was roughly contemporary to what we're going to talk about in a moment, the Battle of Kadesh, the most noble battle between the Egyptians and the Hittites. In the aftermath of this king sought alliances with the Hittites, or perhaps the Hittites sought alliances with the Kassites. Despite this, and despite actual promises to join the Hittites, to join in promised alliances with them, the Hittites would actually say about Kadashman Tuguru to his son, "They used to call your father a king who prepares for war, but then stays at home." His personal seal also bore the image of suckling animals, supposedly representing the nurturing nature of the king towards people in his kingdom. This king wanted to cultivate himself as once again shepherd of the people, but as he was doing so, as he was focusing on the home front, focusing on economics and focusing on culture, this peace treaty with the Assyrians left the Assyrians free to focus on another old enemy of theirs, the Mitanni. And as the Kassites tried to rebuild their state, the Assyrians expanded theirs. And things beyond the Babylonian River Valley were quickly beginning to move beyond their control.
You see, in a broader sense, all of this chaos, whether it's chaos in Egypt, Kassites, with the Assyrians, with the Mitanni. On a broader sense, what that really did was give an opportunity to the Hittites. So the Hittites had managed to survive the collapse of their first empire. They'd done it by the skin of their teeth, but in the core areas of Anatolia around their capital of Tusis, they had managed to maintain enough cohesion and enough prosperity that their nation survived, even if it was in a much reduced state and being forced to pay tribute to the new empire of Egypt. And they lingered like this for almost 150 years. But suddenly a couple opportunities began to present themselves. One of the most significant, and in fact the first step, if you will, on the road to the new Hittite Empire, which would become arguably one of the strongest nations in the Middle East for a brief time, was the revolt of Aleppo. If you recall, Aleppo is an immensely important, well-fortified, and strategic city in Syria. It had been a vast prize the Hittites had fled to control in order to maintain their trade routes into Mesopotamia proper, and the Egyptians had taken it under the reign of Thutmose III. However, Aleppo revolted against Egyptian rule during this period. Now, there's some pretty strong evidence that the Hittites were encouraging this revolt. They may have in fact been funding it behind the scenes. We can't say for certain, but the timing is really convenient. Although, if that was the Hittite plan, it didn't work as well as they'd hoped. Aleppo does successfully throw off Egyptian rule and reestablish a new kingdom of Aleppo, and then basically thumb their nose at the Hittites and say, well, who cares about a bunch of Anatolian barbarians? The Hittites were less than pleased by this. Now, the reason this works, and the reason this is also an opportunity, is this is during the reign of, as mentioned, the pharaoh Akhenaten. And Akhenaten attempts a pretty radical reform of Egypt's religions. Some call it a sort of proto-monotheism. It's kind of that. The worship of the sun, but also the worship of the pharaoh as a living god, so it's kind of a duotheism, arguably. And to make a long story very short, the religious priestly class in the temples of Egypt are immensely politically powerful and immensely economically powerful, and some have theorized that Akhenaten is actually trying to basically eliminate them as threats to his own authority. But all he really succeeds in doing is making them very angry at what he's doing. There's a reason he's called the heretic pharaoh in some sources, which, as I always tell students, what must you do as a man who worships a god to be a heretic? Apparently it's decided that all the other gods aren't real. Egypt enters this period of inward focus. Akhenaten really didn't care all that much about Egypt's possessions on the Nile. And also there's all this internal strife. And after his death, his son then has to deal with this, and ultimately Egypt reverts to its old traditions, but his son's a boy, King Tut, or Tutankhamun. The Hittite king Tutalius, who takes power around the year 1436 BCE, sees the opportunity this presents and decides to strike while the iron is hot. Tutalius doesn't live to see his grand vision succeed, but he does lay the groundwork for his successors to lead to the revitalization of the Hittites. He uses this opportunity to basically throw all of his resources at reunifying the greater Anatolian region and the various non-Hittite parts of the country under his control. The reason they hadn't risked this before was that was not something the Hittites could sustain without outside regions of their control and also control of outside trade routes. Basically, they could maintain equilibrium in the core of their domains, but they couldn't maintain equilibrium outside of it very long. Tutalius gambled that they could succeed in moving beyond this, and thankfully for the Hittites, he was successful. Upon his death in 1380 BCE, he is succeeded by a man known as Suppiluliumus, one of those crazy Hittite names. And Suppiluliumus, who will reign for almost 50 years, basically transitions the Hittites into what some call the Imperial Age, the age of the Hittite Empire. Using the army that his forefather, Tudhalias, had built, he begins a series of lightning campaigns. He strikes at the Mitanni, who are already kind of weakened in this period with Assyria breaking free, and subdues them completely. The Mitanni are allowed to keep their dynasty on the throne in exchange for swearing utter obedience to the Hittites, and even though the Hittites didn't say this, they hoped the Mitanni would be a useful buffer against Assyria. And with economic and military aid from the Hittites, the Mitanni were able to, at the very least, hold the line for a time against Assyrian aggression, and the Assyrian king kind of bogged down for the Kassites, helped them in that regard as well. Beyond this, Suppiluliuma then sweeps into Syria. Both Aleppo and the great city of Carchemish fall before him. He deposes their monarchs, eliminates their dynasties, and places two of his sons upon the thrones of those kingdoms, basically bringing that entire region under his control, and once again opening valuable overland routes both into Mesopotamia and in Egypt. He reaches out to the Kassite king of Babylon at this point, remembering the mistake of his forefathers. He chooses peace rather than war. He requests a marriage alliance, and does in fact receive a Kassite princess to be one of his many brides. Some Hittite records claim that with this act and the treaty that was signed, Babylon became a vassal of the Hittite Empire. Not really. It did open the vital markets of Mesopotamia and the vital overland routes to Afghanistan to the Hittites, and the Kassites profited enough from this relationship they were willing to maintain it even after the alliance it was more or less crumbled in that regard. Interesting point of fact, the same almost worked for Egypt. You see, at the same time, Suppiluliuma is consolidating Syria and forming an alliance with Kassite Babylon. This is the time that King Tutankhamun, or Pharaoh Tutankhamun, of Egypt dies. And as we should know, Tutankhamun dies without heirs, and thus a struggle for the throne of Egypt is about to begin. There was a letter preserved that Tut's widow wrote to Suppiluliuma, requesting that the king of the Hittites send one of his sons to be her husband and become the new pharaoh of Egypt, presumably so that then the king of the Hittites would use his military power to protect her from what was about to happen. And in fact, Suppiluliuma agrees to this, and one of his younger sons is sent to Egypt to marry the young widow. He is assassinated en route, mostly likely by Egyptian nobles who had no intention of allowing a Hittite pharaoh. After the Hyksos, that probably wasn't ever going to fly. But in theory, it almost happens. What actually happened was that a number of men like Ai and Hanamab, and later Ramses I, will ultimately swallow the power, and the new Ramsid dynasty comes out of that. Nonetheless, by Suppiluliuma's death in 1334 BCE, the Hittites are arguably the dominant economic and military power, not just in Anatolia and Syria, but in theory throughout the entire Middle East. Now, the Assyrians were definitely a rising power and seen as a potential serious threat to Hittite hegemony, and while Egypt was weak at this time, it was also seen as a potential threat. But for a brief period of time, the Hittites looked to be on top. This continues for some time. However, tensions continue to rise between the Egyptians and the Hittites over the course of about the next 50 years. The reasons for this is the Ramsid dynasty, which had restored Egypt to its glory after the rather disastrous reigns of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. But the Ramsids were also ambitious, and the young pharaoh Ramses II decided that he was going to reestablish Egypt's empire. He was going to retake the territories that his predecessors had allowed to lapse, and he was not going to allow these arrogant foreigners to dictate terms. Well, the Hittite king at the time, Muwatallis, is certainly having none of that, because he is the master of Syria. Palestine is not under his rule, but is definitely under his influence, and he has no intention of allowing the Egyptians to have it back. A number of correspondences suggest that Ramses made some fairly haughty demands to the Hittites. The Hittites basically dismissed him as a foolish child, which did not sit too well with the pharaoh, and thus war was probably inevitable. Not the first, but definitely the final battle will be the Battle of Kadesh, fought in 1286 BCE. There were clashes leading up to this, obviously. It's not the sole battle of the war, but this is the battle that decides this conflict. And in theory, at least in the minds of the participants, was going to decide the fate of who would be the hegemony of the region. Now it's called Kadesh, the Battle of Kadesh, because the city of Kadesh, the fortified town on pretty much the border between Hittite and Egyptian territory, was the site of it. On the Megiddo Plain, it was called, a word that becomes Armageddon in English because, well, one, so many wars were fought there, and two, it's mentioned as being the place where the final battle would be fought. A professor of mine said that the locals, the Jewish tribes and others, so many wars had already been fought there, surely the final war would be fought there as well. Now, the Battle of Kadesh is relatively complicated, and the two forces that meet are reasonably equal in size and strength. Ramses brought a large contingent of the Egyptian army, which had been increasingly professional and battle-hardened formation during the Middle and New Kingdoms. He also brought Nubian and Libyan mercenaries who were noted as skilled archers and tough soldiers. And of course, chariots, of which the pharaoh himself drove a chariot, a sign of status as pharaoh to be able to drive a chariot and fire a bow from it. The Hittites brought a very similar force of armored infantry, chariots, archers, and similar battle formations. One of the fascinating things about the Battle of Kadesh to me was that one of the accounts of it indicates this might have been either a very happy accident or perhaps one of the first examples of military counterintelligence in action. According to accounts, as Ramses' army is pushing up the coast toward Kadesh, his outriders notice that there are Hittite scouts probing along the frontiers, basically shadowing his army and following him. Pretty standard procedure to send scouts, especially when you're fighting on the defensive as the Hittites were. And a number of these scouts were captured by Egyptian troops and taken back to be questioned. And they revealed a valuable piece of information, that the royal army of the Hittites had mustered very slowly, and that Muwatallis had not yet reached Kadesh with the bulk of his forces. The city was vulnerable to attack. Except it wasn't. Muwatallis and the royal army were already there. Now, was this bad communications? Was this incomplete information, perhaps when the scouts left? Muwatallis wasn't there. Or did the king give them bad information in hopes that the Egyptians would capture them? There's no 100% evidence to say, but what happened was that Ramses, being somewhat young and hot-headed, definitely convinced of his own victory over his enemies, took his most mobile forces, his chariots primarily, and personally leading them raced ahead to Kadesh, leaving the bulk of his infantry behind him.
The forces were split into 4 different groups. Essentially, 1/4 of Pharaoh's forces were brought forth to Kadesh. Another one was fairly close behind, but the other 2 lagged even further since you had the logistics and army on the march.
Pharaoh reached Kadesh. There was a small Hittite force garrisoned there, but most critically, the Hittite chariot forces were basically waiting in the wings around the city to attack.
Essentially, Hittite king kept the bulk of his army, even more than the chariots, but the majority outside because stationing as large army as that is inside the walls became extremely hard to command in an urban environment. This allowed him to essentially use the city, one, as a visible shield so the pharaoh couldn't see the position of his as he got into position, and he did believe it was still inside the city, and it allowed him to quickly respond on the plains rather than be pulled up for a siege.
Which, with chariots being the primary weapon of war at this time, you need a large amount of open space to maneuver for those to be at all effective. So on the plains around the Orontes River, when Pharaoh moved to attack Kadesh, Muwatallis sprung his trap, as it were, and the 2 forces met in what I'm sure seemed to the locals an apocalyptic clash of armies, probably one of the largest clashes of armies up to that point in history.
Supposedly, it is the largest chariot battle ever fought. It's sort of the Bronze Age Battle of Kursk.
The results of Kadesh are in dispute. Both sides claim victory, and arguably both sides did. There is evidence that despite that Ramses was able to fight free of the trap he was caught in, and that he ultimately did force the Hittites to retreat from the field and allow his army to withdraw. However, he was not able to take the city. Kadesh remained in Hittite hands, and the border did not move 1 inch to the north, which the ultimate goal of his campaign was to reconquer Syria. Ramses claims a grand victory over the Hittites. Muwatallis claims a grand victory over the Egyptians. Probably a little bit like the Battle of Jutland in World War I, where both sides claimed victory. Very little was actually achieved, But strategically, the Hittites are in a better position because they have succeeded in their grander objective of maintaining the border and defending their territories.
It's an interesting battle because it also demonstrates essentially even the effectiveness in this era of maneuver warfare. When Pharaoh moved up and realized the Hittites were in the area, he essentially made a fortified base camp somewhat north of the city. It seems like essentially northwest. And when the Hittites moved into attack, it was when the 2nd Division of his army was moving into position to reinforce it. He essentially struck it with only chariot forces on the side after crossing 2 rivers, threw it into complete disarray, and one half of the forces the Pharaoh had in the field were essentially turned around and sent flying. With that, the Hittites moved toward the camp and essentially hit it so hard from the undefended side, because Pharaoh had primarily focused defenses on the side facing the city, that they began to loot the personal wagons and the camp of the Pharaoh and his troops. At this point, because now the commander is still in the reserve and he's not there leading the Hittites personally, that maneuver warfare, which has allowed you to extend so quick, has now broken down because you lack a chain of command. You lack someone there actually driving them to take Pharaoh. Instead, they've now moved on to the looting portion, thus allowing Pharaoh to demonstrate the sort of use of having the king on the battlefield, the use of actual command structure, and is able to repel them. And with the chariot forces dispelled, well, the Hittites more or less just went into the city and said, well, we've dealt a strong enough damage to you that even with your additional troops and your mercenaries, you probably aren't taking the city.
Which is an interesting example of, I suppose, why tank warfare in World War II was so different. The fact that there were radios available to tank squad commanders for the first time meant you actually could coordinate maneuver warfare in a way that wasn't possible before that.
What it boiled down to was they were able to retreat back in the city. He dealt enough damage that they probably couldn't win a protracted siege, and it was back to the drawing board.
And I imagine, at least in the back of Ramses' mind, but the mind of his commanders, there was always the fear that maybe Muwatallis' vassal kings might commit armies now, and then he's caught in a siege, trying to defend himself too. So, essentially, after this, Ramses decides to abandon the field and retreat back to Egypt, and of course declare victory, which again, he had demonstrated his ability to win a victory on the field. If nothing else, he'd saved face in that regard. And, Ramses is a young man, he'll live into his 90s, so he'll be around for a while. Muwatallis, not so much. He dies relatively shortly after this battle. And history kind of repeats itself. Again, on the eve of what should have been the Hittites' great victory. They had defended the frontiers of their empire. They had defeated a peer power, or at least strategically forced a peer power to withdraw and recognize their border. Yet another decline, one far more disastrous than the first, begins. After Muwatallis' death, a man named Hattusilus III, who was one of the commanders at Kadesh, and who is the uncle to the heir to the throne, usurps it from him and makes himself king. In his own accounts, Hattusilus claims that all regions of the empire were as loyal to me as they were to any other king. In reality, we know at least half the Hittite Empire rebels against him, and a massive civil war breaks out. He does win this civil war, but huge chunks of the empire have to be abandoned basically to win this war, and most of his major vassals, especially along the more so-called barbarian fringes, take this as an opportunity to establish their own independence once again. Mitanni, which had been one of the most valuable allies to the Hittites once it had been subdued in previous periods, descends into a civil war of its own in this period, with both the Hittites distracted, trying to deal with this whole political situation themselves, and Mitanni breaking down the Assyrians, who begin to rapidly expand their own domains in the north, and indeed seriously threaten the Hittites once again. And you have to imagine that after all these years, the Assyrians, who had once been like the most valued trading partners of the Hittites, who had taught the Hittites so much civilization, who have now been not victimized per se, but the Hittites have basically treated them as a deadly enemy to contain. They probably want a bit of revenge themselves. In a fascinating reversal of policy, Hattusilus reaches out to a somewhat older Ramses II and offers one of his daughters to be the pharaoh's bride in exchange for friendship. And Ramses accepts this, and the daughter of Hattusilus is sent to join the pharaoh's harem of, I believe, 100 women. I know it said that Ramses had more than 200 known children. The man got around.
One wonders how valuable sending your daughter is when she's only one of 99 others.
I suspect it was probably more the symbolism of the pharaoh accepts the daughter of a king into his household, etc., etc. Even if Egypt wasn't going to lift a finger to help the Hittites, at the very least, Hattusilus secured his own border, so it served its purpose in that regard. But despite this, and despite whatever meager aid the pharaoh was going to offer, the Assyrians continued to advance pretty much unchecked, and by the end of Hattusilus III's reign, they have actually seized control of the eastern mountain districts and actually taken control of the copper mines in Anatolia, essentially threatening to cripple the Hittites once again. It looks like this is the end for them, but there'll be a few chances to come back. Another king, Tutmosis IV, who reigns after Hattusilus III, actually manages a brief revival. He temporarily halts the Assyrian advance and even reclaims some key border cities along the eastern frontier. He also orders the construction of a navy and undertakes the conquest of the island of Cyprus, which is also rich in copper, which not only reopened copper mines to Hittite control, but being an island in the Mediterranean and fighting a landlocked power, he was sure that the Cyprus mines would always be available despite whatever the Assyrians might do. Groups like the Seha and Gasca river and hill tribes also began increasingly raiding and plundering the frontiers. The ultimate blow, though, was two ultimate blows, really. One is a massive drought that strikes this region, which is not just Anatolia. Droughts strike all across the Middle East during this period of time. It leads to huge crop failures, fears of famine, economic decline. In fact, honoring that old alliance of Hattusilus III, Egypt actually ships large amounts of grain north to Anatolia to stave the worst of the famine and prevent starvation. So, that is to King Tutmosis' credit that he spent enormous sums of money to keep people from starving. But that only further weakens his treasury and weakens his military. Assyria, despite all of this, continues to advance, determined to carve its own name into history. And it looks like, despite whatever successes both Tutmosis IV and his successor, Suppiluliuma II, will have, we're on the verge of a total Assyrian victory. But it's not the Assyrians who will end the Hittites. The Hittites will end through something a little more remarkable than that. A great disaster is looming on the horizon. It won't strike for a few more years yet, but unfortunately, the Hittites and the rest of the powers of the Near East are completely ignorant of what's about to happen.
The Hittites give an interesting example into the double-edged nature of conquest. Essentially, when the Hittites, and many of these other powers are small, they don't have the resource and the manpower call upon like they do when they're a vast empire. When they conquer their neighbors, they gain access to more places, more food, more people, more resources. They're able to build bigger and stronger armies, more sophisticated empires. But the problem in all these scenarios is there's people everywhere. When the Hittites are simply in the center of Anatolia, around Hattusis, you only have the immediate neighbors to contend with. Once you've subdued them, you have your neighbors' old neighbors. Essentially, in the example of the Hittites, they might have had to deal with the other local Anatolian tribes, but as soon as they've subdued them and made their sizable kingdom, then you've got the Hurrians, you've got Anzawa, you've potentially got Greek colonies, you've got Assyrians to deal with. When they become even larger, you have even more vast frontiers that are hard to move armies to. You have gained the attention of other powers, and you now contain so many resources that people are surely after. It becomes a situation where, by virtue of conquest, you can often gain propaganda and morale victories, your armies get better skilled, you become a better commander, and it can continue, you can build this vast empire. But then you fall into a problem. What happens when a trade route's severed? Or what happens when a king is replaced by a not-so-suitable king, or his infant son? You have a situation where this empire, which was so powerful before, isn't properly managed, and it can't contain its threats. And while this is going on in the Hittites, that exact thing is happening to the Kassites. Back in Babylonia, the son of Kadashman-Turgu, the individual who had made peace with the Assyrians after the Assyrian border conflicts and the dynastic struggle with the Kassite nobles and the Assyrian heirs. After Turgu's death, his son Kadashman-Enlil II ascends the throne as a child ruler, and he sits on the throne for 9 years. His reign is most notable for one that seems to be influenced heavily by outsiders. The Hittite king, Hattusili III, that we've talked about, apparently sent a number of correspondences to the Kassites, and he attempted to seek stronger ties with them, trying to more or less get them as an ally, potentially against Egypt, potentially now as a vassal. Seemingly, he was also trying to provoke them to fight the Assyrians. There's a letter that more or less paraphrased boils down to, "You've grown up to be such a strong king, with all of your mighty armies and all your land. Why would you not go out and crush the Assyrians, who are so much smaller than you?" While sending more or less the same message to the Assyrian king, it seems, hoping that the two would fight one another, weaken them, and allow for a new golden age of Hittite domination of the region. It wasn't to come, however, and Kadashman-Enlil II instead seemed to invest much power into his vizier named Iti-Marduk Balutu, who is described by Hattusili III as whom the gods have caused to live for far too long, and from whose mouth unfavorable words never cease.
I was reminded of Napoleon's comment about his own forehead visor.
Seemingly likely did this because the vizier's strategy was to appease the Assyrians and, as much as he could, sever ties diplomatically with the Hittites. And at the same time, they re-established diplomatic ties with Egypt, and they sent a sister of the child king to marry into the harem.
But once again, seems like Ramses II just gets all the ladies.
However, diplomacy is a fickle thing, and Kudur-Enlil, likely the brother of Kadashman-Enlil, ascended the throne also as a child ruler, and he married a daughter of Babylon to the Hittites, once again sparking tension with Ramses II in Egypt. During this time, the Nippur-Enlil temple was repaired and the city flourished. However, things seem to change in 1245 BCE when Shakarti-Shiriash ascends the throne. Later Mesopotamian sources seem to claim that he is the son of Kudur-Enlil, but the timeline doesn't seem to match given how he was a child king, and in fact Assyrian and Hittite kings in their correspondences claim that he is not the son. During the period in which he is in power, there are a number of economic records unearthed, and these actually do seem to point toward economic downturn, kind of echoing the previous struggles of the Amorite Babylon. There is a number of excerpts of loans, of debts, of individuals selling themselves into slavery. There is a note of the king essentially freeing all the women of Nippur, more or less assuming that's a general amnesty for debt slaves. This may indicate likely is another period of economic downturn, is a renewed period of financial crisis. The struggles that the Amorites dealt with, the salinization, the weakening of the soil, likely that hasn't gone away. And it could be that the population declined, this large period of warfare, they moved around different cities, with the Kassites coming, some have been displaced. But with all these cities once again returning to the size they were during World War III, gaining all this territory, it seems like they've had time to build up, and once again, they're hitting their size limit. These fields and these primitive production just can't support the size of empire it's dealing with. And you have the same financial problems coming back. During this time, you've got, right before this guy, 2 child rulers. And even if they didn't mismanage it, it could easily represent the lack of a single guiding vision, with perhaps the child ruler and foreign rulers and viziers all having different ideas about what should be done where. And before them, you have the struggle for the throne between the Kassite lords and the Assyrians and the individual doing that marriage lines. It's basically this big tumultuous blender of just one thing after another, internal struggles mixed with conflicts with neighbors, mixed with financial crisis. At this point, everything seems to be building toward the Kassites not being able to hold on to the empire they've had. This seems to climax when Kashtiliash IV ascends the throne. He was likely the son of the previous king, Shariakti-Shiriash. Kashtiliash IV is most known for his war with Assyria. The Assyrian sources claim that he violated the treaties they had, the demarcated boundary between the two kingdoms, and they claim that they had to exact the revenge Enlil demanded upon this individual for being no infringer. Most likely, Kashtiliash launched some sort of preemptive attack, attempted to take territory, and push into Assyrian lands. This could very likely have been either as part of a Hittite alliance, or it could have been while they believed the Assyrians would be distracted, as the Hittites had recently lost a major battle to the Assyrians. Despite this, however, the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta defeated him decisively, and Kashtiliash and many of his lords, the walls of Babylon were destroyed, and then they massacred many of the people of the city, and then plundered the temples and carried off the statue of Marduk. Tukulti-Ninurta named himself King of Karduniash, King of Sumer-Nakad, King of Sippar and Babylon, King of Nilmun and Mehlua. Dilmun, we mentioned before, is that economic outpost in the Persian Gulf. Mehlua seems to be the Indus Valley civilization, so I'm not sure why he was claimed to be the king of that. It's possibly Assyrian. They refer to a different region as Mehlua, but
Things like that do occasionally happen when dealing with these older languages, like that early Sumerian king said to be beat to death with cylinder seals. We're almost certain the word means something else in context, but we just don't know what it is.
In the aftermath of Tukulti-Ninurta's sack of Babylon, two kings, Enlil Nadid Shumi and Kadashman Harbe II, are both fairly short-reigned. Either they may have likely been Assyrian puppets, or they may have simply been opportunists who tried to claim territory. They might have ruled Babylon, or maybe ruled from a different city and claimed to be it. Whatever the case, they don't seem to be uncontested, and little is known about them other than their participation in this sort of chaotic and tumultuous time. During this time, the Elamites also raided into Babylon. There is some indication that Elamites possibly might have done so out of a sense of loyalty to their marriage alliance with the previous dynasty, but it's just as likely they raided simply because it was an opportunistic target. The Assyrians had rocked in, wrecked the army, broken the walls, and the Elamites all of a sudden were more or less presented with a not defenseless but highly unprepared, highly chaotic and damaged, very rich river civilization that they were right next door to. However, the next Kassite king, Adad Shuma Idina, reigned for 6 years after the other two, but he was ultimately unseated by the Elamites, who then occupied Isin and devastated Marad. Either before, after, or during some combination of these three kings, the king of Assyria appeared to rule directly using a governor for up to 7 years. The entire time period of when exactly what happened is unsure. Essentially, you have a succession of three kings, Assyrian rulership, and Elamite raiding. All in all, Babylon is thrown into chaos, and no one has complete control over the region. As all of this happens, Adad Shuma Usur secures a power base in the south, seemingly. It appears though he was a king, possibly at the same time that some of these other individuals were king, or possibly during the governorship. He eventually retakes control of Babylon. Near the end of his 33-year reign, and possibly due to Akkadian officers rebelling against Tukulti-Ninurta inside the Assyrian army, he is able to retake the city and reestablish at least nominal Kassite Babylonian independence. This individual, Adad Shuma Usur, was possibly the son of Castiliash, the one who the Assyrians claimed to not be a real son of the previous king, claimed to be a sort of usurper, but one way or another he was to reunify Kassite support behind him. And in fact, the Elamite at this time tried to get the Kassite lord to join his cause. He claimed that Adad Shuma Usur was a foreigner. He actually had a more legitimate claim to the throne. He claimed via the marriage alliances with the previous ones that it should be an Elamite king seated, but at the end, the warring nobility, possibly remembering how badly he'd gone before, decided to instead support the new Kassite king and not join up with the foreigners. And in fact, potentially to prove his cred to his various nobles, to show that he was no one's puppet, this individual, Adad Shuma Usur, sent a rather insulting letter to the Assyrians, probably trying to hope to provoke a military response from them so he could show his bona fides. And seemingly it worked. He actually was able to provoke the Assyrians, defeat them in battle, and they even suppressed a revolt where a, quote, son of nobody tried to retake Babylon. His son, Meli-Shippak II, ruled for 15 years. During this time, he made fresh marriage alliance with the Elamites, and he seemed to issue many kudurus of land grants. Possibly at this time, given that the rebellion had just happened, that they had just been all this trouble, he might have attempted to either make new lords or lesser nobility, or at least reward those who had fallen on his side. Likely the use of land at this point was to engender loyalty, to rebuild his forces in the face of all of these pretender crises, in the face of all this financial downturn and the violence that had occurred. During the beginning of Meli-Shippak's reign, the collapse started to occur. The thing that would bring the Hittites down, that would wreck the Egyptians, that would change the course of all Middle Eastern history. But the Kassites in Babylon didn't have a seacoast, and it didn't affect them very heavily. While it might have affected their trade relationships, while it might have sent shockwaves across the domain, the Kassite Babylonian lands were not directly in the path of this destruction. In fact, the Kassite rulers would continue for a couple more kings. Meli-Shippak's son, Marduk Apla Edina I, ruled for 13 years. We see a lot more land grants continue to be handed out. This could very well essentially be a practice of trying to institute a new nobility in the face of all the violence that happened. It's possible that many of the Kassite lords had been killed and captured, and that this was an attempt to more or less build a new aristocracy. However, at the end of his reign, the Elamites returned, led by his uncle, Shutruk Nanhut. During this period of Elamite invasion, another king came to power, Zababa Shuma Edin, who reigned for only a single year and appeared to more or less have no effect in trying to stem the Elamite king's push into Sumer and Babylon. According to later texts, the Elamite king attempted to legitimize his rule by saying through marriage alliances and through, birthright, I should be the one to rule Babylon. During the attempt to stem the Elamites from the west, Marduk Alpha Edina also had to face Assyrian invasions from the north, and at this point it seems the Kassites were pushed to their breaking point. Enlil Nadin Ahi, the final Kassite king, ruled for only 3 years in opposition to the Elamite occupation. His reign was ended when he was finally defeated by Kutur Nanhut, the Elamite son of the last king, and he was sent in chains, once again with his nobles, to the city of Susa, along with a great deal of temple plunder, and once more the statue of Marduk, and thus ended the Kassite Babylonian dynasty.
Tragically, the end of the Hittite Empire, with the decline of Kassite Babylon, and even with Assyria seeming to be on the rise and poised to establish itself as the new power, no one got quite what they wanted. Because civilization in Mesopotamia, and indeed in the broader Mediterranean basin, was about to enter a true dark age. The great nations of the world would seemingly collapse, some vanishing totally. In regions, knowledge and technology would regress. In areas like Greece, literacy itself was lost for hundreds of years. And even the great empires, like the Kassites or the Egyptians, who did survive this, were weakened and ultimately were unable to reassert themselves as serious powers. And yet, the collapse itself remains, if not a complete mystery, certainly one of the great questions of history. There are hundreds of theories as to what caused it, what combination of factors and events ultimately led to this seeming destruction of civilization on a grand scale. Few agree on exactly how it happened.
This has been episode 3 of our series of Mesopotamia. Thank you for listening. You can find us on soundcloud.com/thehistoryhour or The History Hour on YouTube, and you can follow us at The History Hour on Twitter. And if you just love our series, you can find us on Patreon. Let's talk about some silly stuff from the past. We talked a little bit in the previous 2 episodes about temple jobs and how big the role the temple was in everyday society and the economy. Given that the last 2 episodes we have made note of the strange Mesopotamian brewing practices and the nature of the beer, I would like to point out that brewers were often employed by the temple, and it was one of the most prominent sources of employing women and children. So the Mesopotamians got to enjoy sweet, unfiltered onion beer made by child labor.
So we go back into the transitional period after the collapse of Earth 3. We talk about a number of different groups were fighting for power, and there were losers in this. The first thing I mentioned was the cities of Larsha and Isin were fighting over southern Mesopotamia. And Larsha, after it was basically taken over by Amorites, began to win big time. So Isin, the big loser of this particular thing, got worried, to the point where the king at the time, a man named Ira Imiti, went to a soothsayer to say, well, what's the future going to hold? And he got a pretty bad prophecy. He was told, Isin will fall and its king shall die. Now, if you're the king of Isin, that's a pretty bad prophecy. That's suicidal, I guess. But anyway, he's like, well, I don't want to die, so what am I going to do about this? So he decided to try something clever. He went to his gardener, who we only know as Enlil Bani. Probably wasn't named after Gardner. He made Enlil Bani the king of Isin and basically abdicated the throne to the gardener. Now, why did he do that? The plan was simple. He was going to crown the gardener, a vast banquet would be held in celebration of this, and then the gardener would be executed. Thus, the king of Isin would die. Well, I imagine Enlil Bani was not too pleased with this, but being a loyal man, he went through with it. He was given the crown, he was sat upon the throne, a grand banquet was held, and at this grand banquet, the old king Ira Imiti dies. According to the accounts, he swallowed boiling broth and died. How would that? I guess he scalded his insides to death. I don't know. It sounds pretty nasty.
Hey, that might sound silly, but we literally had a U.S. president where they said he died from eating too many cherries. So, shrug.
What makes this funnier, though, is Enlil Bani, the gardener king, is now king in fact. And everyone's like, okay, that's cool. Not only would Enlil Bani reign for 24 years as king, upon his death he was so beloved, he became a local god in Isin.
So we spoke a little bit earlier about walls and their fairly ineffective use to contain an entire border. There are accounts supposedly of the Uruk people building walls to try to contain the Amorite migration. There were the later Akkadian attempts to do the same thing. And seemingly the Amorites just went around. it wasn't very effective.
See, a number of civilizations throughout history have actually struck upon this idea that if walls work so well to defend particular locations, key cities or key fortresses, well, then why can't we just build a wall to defend the entire border? Wouldn't that be so much easier and so much cheaper in the long run than having to maintain huge military forces? On paper, that might sound great, but historically their record is kind of mixed. And the most famous example is, of course, China's Great Wall, which has actually been several walls built over many centuries. The current Great Wall, which is certainly an impressive monument, it's a great tourist attraction, but 1,400 miles of these elaborate stone walls and watchtowers that we estimate cost one life for every 3 feet constructed, and who knows, countless decades and probably billions of dollars in modern terms to construct, and it really was not terribly effective. Groups like the Jurchen bribed their way through the wall, and in times of weakness told the local military commander, we got the forces to wait you out, but here's some silver to let us through, and the military commander's like, yeah, okay, no problem. The Mongols just bypassed the wall because, as the Chinese discovered much to their regret, they couldn't garrison a wall that was that long, and an ungarrisoned wall is really more of a speed bump than an actual defensive procedure. Yet they tried again building what's called the Willow Palisade along their Manchurian frontier. That was more a combination of walls and actual intentional plantings of trees to slow horses down, which you could maybe see what they're going for with that, but again, the Manchurian peoples, again, just went right through it. They weren't slowed hardly at all because it was undefended, and they all became a dynasty of China like the Mongols had done. The Romans were also not as keen to build walls, but a few of them. The most famous, of course, Hadrian's Wall in modern Scotland. Now, Hadrian's Wall is often said, well, that was successful in keeping the Picts out, but keep in mind, it's built along a very narrow bridge of land in England, literally coast to coast, against a group of people on boats. And more than that, Rome stationed like 30,000 troops to defend it. When the troops were withdrawn at the end of the Roman Empire, the Scots went right through it. It was not an obstacle any longer. Similarly, a series of walls the Romans did build along the Rhine frontier to keep the Germanic barbarians out. That's often called a great success by the Romans. That's because it wasn't meant to be an actual defense. That wall was just meant to slow the enemy down long enough for legions stationed at bases further away from the border to actually muster and march to meet them. In that sense, the Romans actually properly understood what walls were supposed to do. But those are exceptions. Historically, nations who thought to fortify their borders have often been very disappointed by the results.
Because here's the interesting thing. Walls and, say, fortifications are a staple of warfare. You see these ancient forts in the Hittite areas to control resources. You see the walled cities of Sumer to, protect the urbanized area from their enemies. You see castles all throughout Europe and all throughout the world during much of that feudal era during the last couple thousand years.
Even during the early modern period, the great star forts constructed to hold back artillery bombardments.
Here's the dirty secret about walls and why they don't work very well in this situation. Walls are great as a defensive weapon. You can use fortifications in a really weird, aggressive manner in some versions, like the way Longshanks did, building walls all throughout Wales to essentially pacify the countryside. But that's a weird example. Think about the most defensive war in sort of living memory, the one that we have easy access to, would be World War I. It was essentially two sides that both wanted the defensive, and when they went on the attack, it was very ineffectual because they didn't have the weapons to deal with it. When you look at this period, these use of city walls are effective because you can fall back to them. You can hold them against an attacker. Even if your army is not able to control within the walls, every one soldier you have is worth many of theirs. And you're able to focus them, and you're able to see where everyone is, and you're able to do this very controlled, very methodical, defensive style of fighting. A border wall is a massive wall. If you're trying to block off the entirety of the Arabian desert, or the entire stretch that would go from Judea and Canaan lands to Mesopotamia, or if you're trying to wall these massive stretches along China, or honestly across the American-Mexico border, you're looking at a huge wall. You're looking at a wall that would require a huge amount of territory to be covered and a huge amount of people to maintain it at all times. It would have to be a militarized border to be effective, and while at times that happens, the problem you once again run into with China is, militarily, there's often a way through it. You can either go around, or you can bribe a single commander. You could try to focus all your force at one point and overwhelm it. You could climb it. Look at Game of Thrones, for example, for such a silly example. Like, this massive impenetrable wall is scaled by people when they aren't looking. That happened in real life. Its use of a border wall of that size has to necessarily be met with an equal amount of investment in time and manpower and funds to just keep an army there. And the idea of trying to hold these walls in and of itself is to adopt a siege mentality. Essentially, when a castle or when a city was laid siege, they were now at the mercy of the logistics of the enemy commander. At that point, you would essentially put all your chips on, my wall's big enough, I've got enough supplies, I hope this guy can't take me. In reality, you are surrendering the tactical advantage, you're surrendering the time and place of conflict, you're surrendering everything except your gamble that those defenses are going to be good enough to hold them. And at a small scale, something like a city, something like a castle, a strategic pass through the mountains, that's possible. When you're talking about vast amounts of area, places where whomever is coming can choose where to cross, when to cross, it becomes a lot more of a gamble. Take, for example, the Kassites built those mini border forts throughout Syria. Those would be even more effective, because those, you would have the ability to station troops there, you would have the ability when one falls to fall back to the next. Instead of hoping that they will see a wall and go home, at least at that point you're being proactive.
Even those have their limits. The Hittites tried a similar strategy in their northern frontiers against the hill tribes. But when their military began to be stretched thin fighting the Assyrians, they had to thin those garrisons, and those forces were overwhelmed. Again, the walls are only as good as the number of people holding.
So really, when you put this into a modern context, and you try to think about what a border wall would actually be, you have to look at something like Northern Ireland. Even if they didn't have like an actual wall, it was militarized. There were checkpoints, there were soldiers, they were willing to use violence. And when you're looking at a situation where what the wall on the American border is supposed to be, it's supposed to keep out drug smugglers and coyotes and criminals, those people are going to find a way in. You're going to go around it or over it or under it or bribe somebody. It's no different from how it was before. It might be a slight bit more of an inconvenience, but really what it is most of the time is essentially trying to contain large migrations, which most of those groups go to ports of entry. Most of them seek to enter the United States through the legal way. And so this use of a border wall, it harkens back to ancient days and these ideas of trying to stop these violent migrations, but even then, there were Amorites living among them. The Amorites had already made personal relationships. The Kassites had been viable members of Mesopotamian society. To really look back at that strategy and say that's what we should use is not only stupid, is not only short-sighted, is not only wasteful, but it is outright looking at the failures of the past and saying, yeah, sure, let's do that again.